Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, a Blizzard classic, Diet Strider, and another Natsume hit. Hi, I'm your host Jared, and today is June 9th, 1993. Before orcs and humans, they had Vikings and trucks. Released June 4th, 1993 for the Super Nintendo, was Rock and Roll Racing. Rock and Roll Racing is an isometric combat racing game. Select your truck, pick its color, and race around the track against up to 3 other opponents. You come equipped with weaponry, meaning that you're also looking to blast away other racers. They don't die, just get slowed down for several seconds. Depending on your finish, you'll earn money you can use to upgrade your vehicle between tracks. Throw in a 2-player split screen versus mode, and get ready to jam out. Rock and Roll Racing was developed by Silicon and Synapse, who is known today as Blizzard Entertainment. One of the playable racers in Rock and Roll Racing is one of the Lost Vikings from the previous game, The Lost Vikings. It also started out as a completely different game. It was being developed as a direct sequel to their first racing game, RPM Racing, released on the Super Nintendo in November of 1991. It features the same kind of isometric viewpoint and cars exploding. So RPM Racing 2 only became the Rock and Roll Racing we know today, all thanks to last-minute interference. The publisher was Interplay, and Blizzard presented them a finished game ready to go and dusted off their hands. Interplay's marketing team saw it and said, and I quote, "Sure, but what if it had baller-ass music?" That was their plan to sell copies. Their first attempt was to contact ZZ Top to license his music, but his price point ended up being way too high. They instead contacted a third-party music service that provides low-cost licensed music to use in public settings. Think of a lot of those rock songs that would appear in commercials all the time. Basically songs like that. Black Sabbath, Steppenwolf, Deep Purple, just a few of the known artists that had their music converted into an SNES sound chip. This made it go from a typical racing game to rock and roll racing. Now, they had a game that they could market. And that they did. The box art of Rock and Roll Racing proudly proclaims the music in a bright yellow starburst. Preview coverage, like the one seen in Nintendo Power issue 52, makes it a front bullet point, and magazine advertisements also made sure to showcase the digitized music. What also helped was that the game was good. Reviews coming in were very positive. GamePro magazine awarded it generally high scores. EGM gave it an 8 out of 10, stating that music does make a difference, and Nintendo Power's average review score was a 3.8 out of 5. Rock and Roll Racing would get ported to the Sega Genesis in 1994, and there was going to be a 3DO version in 1995 that got canceled. It would also get ported to the Game Boy Advance in 2003, and also got a refreshed definitive edition in the Blizzard Arcade Collection, which now has 16:9 support, 4-player split screen, and even more licensed rock and roll music with the option to play them in CD quality. A well-beloved RPG developer's non-RPG game, released on June 8th, 1993, was Run Saber for the Super Nintendo. Run Saber is a side-scrolling action game. Select your hero and then travel the world to slash everything that isn't you. Use a multitude of techniques such as a simple sword slash to spin attacks and climbing on walls. Fight bosses at the end of levels, and for an extra fun time, play it in 2-player co-op. Run Saber was published by Atlas and developed by the studio Horisoft, who you probably best know for developing games such as Run Saber. And that's literally it. You probably better know their hardware origins with Hori accessories, which are still being made to this day. This was their one attempt at making their own video game. The gameplay of Run Saber looks very inspired by other action games like the Valis series or Strider. In fact, a little too inspired. Everyone who talked about Run Saber in their reviews commented that this is essentially Strider for the Super Nintendo. It got good review scores, but EGM just said it's basically unlicensed Strider 2, and GamePro magazine rated it well, whilst also calling it Strider 3 times in their review. Run Saber has a very anime-inspired aesthetic and appearance, in spite of the cover art being done by the famed fantasy artist Julie Bell, who also did the art for Strider. The two main characters, Alan and Sheena, are about as anime as they get, complete with protagonist-colored hair. Japanese magazine advertisements had their own art of the two main characters. In Japan, accessory maker Hori had a line of special Super Famicom controllers called Fighting Commander controllers. They put all 6 buttons on the face of it, making it ideal for pretty much Street Fighter 2, and that's it. Japanese magazine previews and advertisements made sure to mention a Fighting Commander Gold controller that was limited edition and was to commemorate the release of Run Saber. However, for reasons lost entirely to time, Run Saber never released in Japan, which is too bad. The game's solid and you should pop it in when you get the chance for a quick little romp, which is easier said than done because this is another one of those games that never got any kind of port or re-release, making it only on the Super Nintendo. And that isn't the only one. Also released in June 30 years ago for the Super NES was Pocky and Rocky. Pocky and Rocky is essentially a cute-em-up, or a shoot-em-up with cute characters. Play as the Shrine Girl Pocky or the Tanuki Rocky to take down all kinds of enemies. Upgrade your shot into a spread attack or a more damaging fireball. You can also use a melee swing to damage enemies and deflect weaker shots. Defeat bosses at the end of levels and get to the very end, and be sure to bring a friend along for some 2-player co-op. Pocky and Rocky began life as an arcade game from Taito called Kiki Kai Kai. The SNES game is essentially a remastered port of that for home consoles, only Taito didn't make it. They licensed the game out to Natsume, who changed the name to Pocky and Rocky for the international release. By this time in 1993, Natsume had only ever released one other Super Nintendo game, Spanky's Quest. Natsume went hard on the marketing for it. Magazine outlets were getting preview builds early in the year. EGM gave a full-page preview in their February 1993 issue, and GamePro magazine had a review for it in their April 1993 issue, even though Pocky and Rocky would not release until June. Why? Again, marketing. Additional magazine advertisements continued to print in the months leading up to and after the game's release. Their magazine ads went from simple, "Play our 2-player game" to "The press loves our game and you will too. Buy it." Which, to be fair, they were right. Pocky and Rocky is a great game. EGM gave it an average score of an 8.5 out of 10 and the Editor's Choice Gold Award, loving the innovations like having a deflect button and the screen scrolling vertically and horizontally for a shoot 'em up. GamePro magazine gave it an almost perfect score, and Nintendo Power gave it an average of a 3.5 out of 5. However, it didn't exactly sell super well, making it a bit of an SNES obscurity. They would try again with Pocky and Rocky 2 in 1994, and then a third game called Pocky and Rocky and Becky for the Game Boy Advance. Unfortunately, when Taito was bought by Square Enix, the licensing rights to Pocky and Rocky got muddy since it was made by Natsume based on a port from Taito. Because of this, there has never been a port or virtual console release of Pocky and Rocky, making it only on the Super Nintendo. Sort of. They may not be allowed to release the same game, but they can remaster it. In 2022, a remaster of the original game with new stages and some tweaked old ones was released called Pocky and Rocky Reshrined. You can play that version right now on Steam, PlayStation 4, and Nintendo Switch. Also, wagging his tail adorably for everything else released this week, here's Editor Dylan.
Pocky and Rocky had a rodent named Rocky, and Rocky Rodent won't release until late summer. But the OG rodent named Rocky released a platformer on the SNES with the adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and friends. I have a unique history with these guys. In the 90s, I would frequent a Chuck E. Cheese knockoff called Bullwinkle's Family Fun Center. Arcades, mini-golf, laser tag, bumper boats, go-karts, but most importantly, the animatronics. They were so old and decrepit that the music they played on stage was completely drowned out by the ear-piercing mechanical whirring of Bullwinkle's movements. And the game, much like Bullwinkle's food offerings, is bland and uninspired. I wonder if any Bullwinkles are still around. MiG-29 Fighter Pilot is a flight sim on the Genesis. And like most console flight sims, the frame rate functions more like a slideshow. But I did learn a couple things from its commercial.
MiG-29 Fighter Pilot has what Genesis flyboys are waiting for in flight sim air combat action, and MiG-29 Fighter Pilot takes advantage of the expanded functionality of Sega's new 6-button controller.
First of all, Genesis Flyboys. God, I love the 90s. Second, I'm glad Genesis games are pushing the 6-face button controller so early. Something that only Hori can provide on the Super Nintendo. Oh, what a callback! World Heroes 2 is another SNK fighter for the Neo Geo. Or is it ADK? I don't know what the difference is. It's something DK. He's the leader of the bunch. We covered the first game at length in our September 16th, 1992 episode, but it's basically what if Doc Brown stopped hanging out with high schoolers and instead kidnapped historical figures to fight to the death. If I'm honest, that's a freaking spot-on synopsis. You can't be more clear than that. Is it just me, or is this game way harder than the first one? It's a fact that I'm awful at fighting games, but this one suffers from what is commonly used by the fighting game community as SNK boss syndrome. What everyone else calls it is bullshit AI. It's almost as if the opponent knows what I'm gonna do before I even press a button. Or I just suck, but either way, it doesn't have my Shiranui, and therefore it's not as good as Fatal Fury 2. Hopefully next year they'll improve the game by rebalancing characters, maybe adding new ones, and slapping a vehicle on the name. Like World Heroes 2 Helicopter, or maybe World Heroes 2 Zeppelin. Yeah, it's probably gonna be Zeppelin. 7 games released on these 3 consoles this week in 1993. Update: there is at least one Bullwinkle's open in Oregon, but it looks like the animatronics were replaced by a bowling alley, and the arcades switched from tokens to the gamer cards that Dave & Buster's uses. How fun. Sound off in the comments if you had an obscure arcade growing up, or if you're strictly a Charles Edmund Cheddar kind of kid. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Dylan. Here in the Collector's Corner, Rock and Roll Racing released with a price tag of $59.99. The game cartridge alone is now worth about $40, and about $120 for a complete copy. Run Saber also released costing $59.99 and has actually come down in price since last year. A loose copy is worth $90, and with the box and manual, it's worth $340. Pocky and Rocky is this week's biggest value gainer. Its original price was a weird $64.95. Now, just the game alone goes for $170. With the box and manual, it rockets up to $475. And that's it for today. Next week, Run and Gun with a generic person-sounding name, an adorable Sega action game, and an epic tale of alien invasion, time travel, the lost city of Atlantis, is all seen by a dolphin. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. If you want to help support the channel, please consider checking out our Patreon, link in the description down below. Also, like the video and leave a comment down below, especially if you played any of the games this week. Subscribe if you aren't already, and if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much for watching this show every single Friday. I remember where I first saw Pocky and Rocky is actually when I went to my childhood's friend's house. He didn't have it, but the neighbor kid directly next door in the duplex did, so sometimes we'd go over there and play it. We never got past level 2. We were bad.